in which it turns out to be an excellent Christmas by Stephen Ira, using characters created by Simon Creek. Music taken from Sufjan Stevens.
I saw 3 ships come sailing in on Christmas Day, on Christmas.
You've been feeling very cheerful, I can see, Seth remarks when he sees George's almost entirely barren apartment. There is no Christmas tree, although Seth does seem to detect the presence of 2 unenthusiastically hung garlands, hanging on for dear life to the kitchen windowsill. "I'm what?" George asks absently. He, perhaps understandably, is still focused on the presence of a foreign body in what may not really be his home, but is certainly his apartment. "Cheerful," Seth says, his lips starting to crack apart into a tentative grin. "See, the sarcasm thing? I'm getting the hang of it." George manages a grin. "You are," he agrees, in a tone he can only hope is encouraging. He is much too tired to try inspiring anybody, and feels that he can probably do more good anyway by feeding them and giving them a place to stay. "Rising skills and sarcasm aside," he adds, setting down his cup of tea on the coffee table, "for how long do you anticipate needing asylum?" Seth's face collapses like a flan in a cupboard, and he swings his feet until they nearly hit the underside of the table that he's sitting on. "Why am I letting him sit on the coffee table?" cries out a small and heartless part of George's brain. "The boy's notions of furniture uses are beyond me." At least, George reflects, Seth now knows the meaning of words like anticipate and asylum, which he certainly wouldn't have a few months ago. "Well?" George prompts, then winces at his tone. "Not to imply that you're unwelcome. You are in difficulty, and I believe that I, of all people, can perceive its particular nature to some extent. So," he says rather lamely, and gestures with his mug, "please don't look at me like your face is a ball of tinfoil." Seth blinks, and George winces again as the boy gnaws a bit of skin off of his lip. "My dad made me get undressed," Seth says rather suddenly, and George goes even paler than usual and grabs tighter hold of the tea mug. "And, he saw, welts and bruises, and, he was pissed off that I'd been, using bandages or whatever." George swallows a scorching throatful of Earl Grey. "Well," he says in a carefully level voice, "I do not presume to criticize a man I do not know and do not expect or hope to know, but that seems rude, intrusive, and inappropriate." "Yeah," Seth says, a grateful, warm sound. "That's what I thought." It is hard to tell if this is really what Seth thinks at the time, or if, Seth being Seth, self-esteem vacuum of the universe, he really thought it was all right. "You were right," George affirms, just in case, and restrains the impulse to touch Seth's shoulder. He no longer worries that Seth will misperceive such contact, but who wants to be touched when they've just been forced to strip? Particularly, George thinks blackly, staring down into his tea with directionless anger, people like us, and by his own father, for Christ's sake. Seth says nothing. George gets up to make more tea. Without thinking, he decides chamomile is best, and when he hands it to Seth, attempts a manly clap on the shoulder. Seth, whose native language is gesture, gives George a momentarily amused look at such silliness, but then seems to remember that it is Christmas, and he gives George what is most definitely a look of, "I appreciate the thought." Because, despite any reactionary hostility to what George would call queer assimilation into heteronormative paradigms, he does. Terence, while incensed by Hollis and confused by Seth, cannot help but be overjoyed at the presence of a child during Christmas. Granted, Terence seems to be spending most of his time in the bedroom making strange noises with George. Granted that the child in question is only 2 years younger than Terence himself. Granted that Seth hasn't believed in Santa Claus for years and years. All that granted, Terence doesn't care. Seth is small and sad and prickly, and therefore almost Dickensian. Aside from the bit about being prickly, George points out, which has no literary precedent, and Terence has resolved to make him less so. "It is like having a munchkin around again," the man himself points out to George, floating around the kitchen, making what appear to be Christmas cookies. A small person who sings in an inordinately high voice and represents the Lollipop Guild? George asks. And is the first color character in the film? No, Terence pouts. You are no fun at all. I just mean a kid, a kid, who's all sort of glowy and excited around Christmas. George momentarily contemplates telling Terence that Seth's current continuous expression isn't so much glowy and excited as it is stunned, but he decides Terence's mood is too nice to spoil. Still, he feels the compulsion to be a realist, and so tears himself away from the cookies, not to mention the Terence, and finds Seth.
Oh come, Emmanuel.
Terence has apparently issued the boy 5 garlands and an ultimatum to hang them, but Seth, who does not seem to possess the imagined innate homosexual talent for interior design, is only standing by the coffee table with all 5 strings of tinsel swimming vaguely around his perpetually bare feet. Doing well with the garlands? George asks, and Seth laughs, demonstrating further progress in the area of sarcasm recognition. Enormously, says the kid, and grins sheepishly. I'm sorry I can't be less of a downer. I mean, I feel like I'm, impinging upon a Christmas honeymoon. He stands stork, one sharp heel rubbing against the inside of a sharper knee. George, despite having cringed at imphingy, shakes his head. You aren't, he says. Not at all, really. I mean, it's all very classically Christmas-like, isn't it? Terence is a little bit ecstatic to have a, quote, munchkin, unquote, around. You'd be Dickensian, even, if you were a little less prickly. God bless us, Seth says wickedly, and flicks one garland like a ribbon dancer in a pastoral ballet. Everyone. I always said, he adds with a shrug, I have to have some kind of nuclear family unit for Christmas, even if it is temporary. Part of George wants to tell him it doesn't have to be temporary, but most of him has just been vigorously reminded by an uprooting that everything is temporary. Instead, he says something mindless and awkwardly claps Seth on the shoulder again.
Jesus, our brother, strong and good.
Seth is actually put to bed on Christmas Eve, a fact he finds inwardly hilarious, but which Terence seems to take as a matter of course. He is tucked in, seriously tucked in, by a flushed and gingerbread-smelling boy who Seth fervently prays does not believe in having sex, even with George, even after 6 months, on Christmas Eve. George comes in some time afterward with a mug of cocoa and a somewhat ridiculous grin which he attempts to remove when he sees that Seth has noticed it. He fails. Ha, Seth says. Terence certainly is a trip. George's grin shamefully widens. He is, the man agrees, and fidgets like a schoolgirl with his loosened tie. Seth laughs. You're acting 12, he informs George. Yes, George agrees ruefully. Well, you're acting about 5, although that's hardly your fault. My God, did he honestly tuck you in? He did, Seth says. Thanks for the cocoa. George does something that would be called a shrug on anyone but George. Not at all, he says. And if you need anything, you'll call, yes? Well, Seth says, and smiles wryly at the thought of night terrors. I won't be able to help it, will I? George's face softens another degree. At this rate, it might as well be cashmere. No, he says. No, I suppose not. Merry Christmas, by the way. He leaves without attempting to hug and unbound Seth, a consideration the aforementioned Seth deeply appreciates. Seth lies warm and small between the sheets for a while, more confused than happy, in a bed that is too big for him. He feels something else as well, though, something definitely pleasant. Safe is better than ecstatic or madly joyful, Seth knows. Even the confusion he feels isn't entirely unpleasant. It's just there, organically, like rocks or trees or mad youngish English teachers and their boyfriends, offering tea and cocoa in a safe place to sleep at night. This has been a Tranny Hallmark Moment production.